Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar hosted by the Organization Development and Change, Workforce Education and Development Program at Penn State. This is a monthly webinar series presented during our lunch hour. My name is Halima Hatta. I'm a PhD student in the Workforce Education and Development Program at Penn State University. I will be moderating today's webinar along with my colleagues Marshall Dumel, who is a PhD student in the same program as well, and Nadia Waterton, part-time marketing specialist. In terms of the integrative format for this webinar, please use the chat features in the Zoom platform. If you have any question about the presentation, please use the chat features on the Zoom. You can see the chat button at the bottom of the screen. The Q&A session will be at the end of the presentation. Our online Master of Professional Studies in Organization Development and Change is designed for professionals who need the skills and knowledge to effectively lead change in their organization. Furthermore, there is a Master and PhD program in Workforce Education and Development with concentration in human resource development and organization development. Our program has created a continuous monthly free webinar series with experts around the world. Today, we are presenting using organization development to build a neurodiversity-inclusive corporate culture presented by Dr. William Brothwell. Dr. William Brothwell has a certificate, professional certificate, such as SHRM, as CBDT, Follow, and others. He is Emeritus Distinguished Professor of Education and Development Program in the Department of Learning and Performance System on the University Park campus of the Pennsylvania University. Before becoming a professor, he had nearly 20 years of practical work experience in OD and HR in government and a multinational business. Since arriving at Penn State University in 1993, he has established 3 consulting companies, 1 personal care home for the elderly, and 1 motel and 1 company to rent vacation home. He is author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of almost above 180 now or 70, like it is increasing books. And he has presented like over 1,600 talks on every country expect and creative. He won the 2022 OD Network Lifetime Achievement Award. For more information about Dr. Rothwell bio, please visit today's webinar page on Eventbrite. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming our speaker today. Dr. Rothwell, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Halima, and I'm delighted to be joining you today to talk about using OD to build a neurodiversity-inclusive corporate culture. You can see my email from this title slide, and if you'd like to reach out to me later on, feel free to do that. But I'm going to launch right into my talk. I have a habit of developing too many slides for the time I'm allotted, so I'm going to move through these quickly, hold your questions until the end, but I'm very willing to share these slides with you after the presentation, so you really don't need to worry about taking notes. And this is being recorded, so if you would like to share the talk at a future time with a colleague, you will be able to do that through the archives of the Professional Development Network at Penn State. So let me get right into it, the opening and the issues. So organizations increasingly recognize that neurodiversity, which we could define as including autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and related cognitive differences, is not a difference to be, not a deficit to be accommodated, but rather a difference that represents an untapped source of talent and innovation. And we desperately need that at a time when we are hearing repeatedly from organizations of all kinds about the need for the talent shortages that they face and the need for upskilling, reskilling, new skilling, and cross-skilling. At the same time, organizations are struggling with an increasingly rapid rate of change. And there are many ways to deal with that. Of course, change management is one of those. I've been in the OD field since 1979, and during that time, change management and organization development have never been more needed than they are today in the fast pace of today's organizations. So in this 1-hour webinar, I'm going to try to cram in as much as I can about how organization development principles, processes, and change interventions can be intentionally applied to help organizations create psychologically safe, inclusive environment in which neurodiverse employees can thrive. So like any good trainer, I do have objectives, targets to be met by the end of today's talk. Here they are. I will explain what we mean by the term neurodiversity, and I'll cover it through an OD lens. I'll identify organizational norms, systems, and practices that unintentionally exclude the neurodiverse. I'll talk about how we can apply OD core principles to designing inclusive cultural change initiatives. I'll talk about how select OD interventions can support building a corporate culture that allows everyone to feel psychologically safe, included, and to experience equity in their environment. And you can see the agenda. And like any good manager, I do have an agenda for this short meeting. At first, I'll open and frame the issue. Then I'll talk about how we understand neurodiversity through an organization development lens as opposed to other lenses that we might use. I won't talk about those. This talk is really focused on using organization development. We'll talk about diagnosing some of the real-world cultural barriers that lead to problems with neurodiversity inclusion. We'll talk about OD interventions that support building those neurodiversity inclusive cultures. We'll talk about implementation and sustainability, and then we'll close. We'll give you some key takeaways, and I'll allow some questions and answers. Now, of course, I've just published 2 books. I published more than that, actually, but these are the 2 most relevant to today's presentation. The book on the left, I literally got in my hands just a few days ago, and the book on the right, the same thing. Both books have a 2026 publication date. The book on the left, written with my Canadian colleague, Jonathan Zion, who is neurodiverse himself, so he speaks from personal experience. We talk about how a company can reinvent its entire HR system to be more inclusive for the neurodivergent population. And then the other book, of course, that's relevant And some of you know this book. Its predecessor, which had a green cover, is the college text for the first course in the Penn State OD Master Professional Studies in OD program. And this is the newest edition that took over 3 years to develop. I've published many other books relevant to OD here and to neurodiversity. Here's the book on the left is a simulation. The book on the right is also a simulation of organization development. They can be used as college textbooks. I have a book on one of several on diversity, written with some of my diversity colleagues. I just published another book on empathy coaching and how we can improve interpersonal relationships at work, which is so critical in today's world. Remember, Elon Musk said, empathy is for losers. And I can think of no better recommendation for how desperately needed it is than Elon Musk saying that. So let's get to it. Of course, I've published more than 170 other books, but I won't talk about those today. The focus here is on neurodiversity. So in this part, we'll talk about what is neurodiversity. What are some of the things we need to do to move from accommodating, as required by U.S. law, the workplace for conditions that would accommodate individuals who have invisible disabilities. We consider neurodiversity to be one of those, to a system level inclusive corporate culture. We'll talk about OD values that are relevant to neurodiversity, how important it is in OD to allow everyone to participate in decision making that affects them, how important it is to demonstrate respect for others, how we want to collaborate in doing our work, and cultures and norms that are so important in building an inclusive environment. So, where did we get this term neurodiversity? It's a concept that variations in human brains like autism, ADHD, and dyslexia are natural and valuable differences, not deficits, reflecting the diverse ways people think, learn, and interact. It's a term that was coined by sociologist Judy Singer, and it promotes inclusiveness by viewing the people with neurological differences as a normal part of human diversity. So we don't set out to fix people. We set out to take advantage of their strengths and build on those strengths and appreciate those strengths. So why do we care about neurodiversity now? Well, one reason is, and I'm a business owner, so I can tell you that trying to hire any kind of employee today is going to be quite an experience. You get people who accept a job offer and then don't show up on the first day. That's called ghosting. You get people who apply for jobs. You might get 100 resumes, and of those, only 1 or 2 actually meet the requirements that were in the job ad that was advertising the open position. And when you do hire people, keeping them may be exceptionally difficult because employers are in a competition to attract the best, develop the best, and retain the best. So how do we define the best? Well, that is a debatable question, and one we could easily devote its own webinar to talking about. So there's a need to find ways to tap new sources of talent. Now, years ago, I wrote a different book. The title was Working Longer. And in that book, I talked about with some colleagues how we could tap the retiree base of baby boomers and others to deal with talent shortages and succession planning problems that were coming about as a result of demographic change. Today, we still face some of those changes, and tapping the retiree base is still a viable option, among others, for employers. I also wrote a different book about 100 ways to get work done without tiring or without promoting anyone. And of course, you could probably brainstorm some of those methods. But the point is that we can meet the needs for our staffing and our work in ways that don't include necessarily hiring or promoting. We can automate, we can rely on artificial intelligence, we can offshore, we can hire consultants, we can push work onto vendors, we can push work onto customers. There's many ways to get work done. But today we're focusing on neurodiversity as one of those staffing strategies that has historically been overlooked. Did you know that the one group of people most likely to be unemployed globally are the neurodiverse? And as a result, every government in the world is or should be highly incentivized to find ways to employ the neurodiverse. Why? Because unemployment leads to social problems, social upheaval. It leads to increases in crime. It leads to increases in immigration. It leads to many issues that today are hot button political issues that our politicians struggle to come up with approaches to solve those problems that the public can accept. I believe looking at the neurodiverse is an untapped area. Many companies have looked at this, but a growing number will be forced to do more so. So look at the first statistic on this slide. Around 15 to 20% of the global population is neurodivergent. Do the math. There are presently 7 billion people in the world. That means that 20% of 7 billion is a population bigger than the United States population. And we're talking worldwide. So different types of neurodivergent conditions affect different groups. As you can see, ADHD affects roughly 5 to 10% of the worldwide population. Autism, which we know is a growing issue worldwide, and about 1 in 31 children ages 8 in the US are identified with, they're on the autism spectrum. And it's more common for boys. It's also a condition more common when the parent, the male parent, is older. So we know that this is a condition that is only going to become more important over time. And it's important to understand that there are over 600 documented neurodiverse conditions, over 600. And most schools are not equipped to diagnose neurodivergent conditions in school children. Far from it. And what about employers? Do you think the average employer can identify when a neurodivergent condition may be affecting an employee's job performance? No. And neither are schools able to identify it when it affects the ability of a child to learn in school. So this is quite an important population that we need to pay more attention to. But as we do that, we have to be sensitive to the needs of the people in this population. So there are sensory differences. There can be difficulties with executive functions. There can be challenges in ways that individuals adapt to new work environments, and think about how quickly conditions are changing today. Just think about the conditions we faced in the COVID era and how many people had to stop going to a physical location for work or school and had to participate online, and the special challenges that that raised for everyone, including the neurodiverse. Strengths and weaknesses are not evenly distributed, and that can create unique challenges for employers, for school teachers, for parents, for everyone. So neurodiversity recognizes variations in brain function as natural human differences, just like age differences, racial differences, gender differences, and we must grow to appreciate those and learn how to leverage to advantage those differences. So in the context of neurodiversity, shifting from individual accommodation, which is required by law in the US under the Americans with Disabilities Act, we have to think about how we can manage those issues company-wide. And that was the focus in my recent book, Winning the Talent Wars Through Neurodivergence. The focus was on how employers could revisit their entire HR system and make it more inclusive and more welcoming for people with these neurodivergent conditions. And of course, involving them in that process, involving the neurodivergent population in making those determinations would be a principle critical in organization development. So I think OD has ways to make suggestions about how to build that more inclusive environment. The opposite of OD, I would argue, is using bureaucratic compliance thinking, where we force employees to behave in certain ways simply because we are worried about lawsuits and union grievances and other things that, other unpleasantries that could result from problems with the way we treat the neurodivergent. So in the context of neurodiversity, applying OD, specifically the areas of participation, respect, collaboration, and learning, where learning is emphasized through teaching by example. Leaders teach by example, managers teach by example, supervisors teach by example, everyone teaches by example. And we have to realize that that is critical in dealing with the neurodivergent, and doing that is a way to apply OD principles to build that inclusive corporate culture. So it involves redesigning the way we think about our total method of managing human beings in work settings. Again, you might call that reinventing our entire HR system, how we recruit, how we hire, how we onboard, how we train, how we define jobs and design jobs, how we organize teams, how we structure the organization, how we provide tools, equipment, software to workers. In short, everything we do has to be rethought if we want to do it from an OD standpoint. Now, here's one of more than 100 published versions of the famous OD action research model, which is the chip inside the OD computer. You might think of OD as like a brand name of a computer. I happen to be using an HP computer, so that's the brand name of the computer. And what makes the computer work is the chip inside. And my computer's got a little label on it that says Intel inside. So the chip that makes that computer work, the driver, the computer within the computer is the chip. And in OD is like the brand name, and the chip inside that makes it work, there could be two. One of those, the oldest and best known, is the action research model, and the other is the appreciative inquiry model. They're very similar with one major difference: where you start. The action research model starts with a problem. We have a problem, we want to solve it, and we want to involve our people in coming up with the identification of the problem, its root causes, the solutions to the problems, the priority of implementing those solutions, the action plans in implementing those solutions, and the metrics by which we measure success. So this is one way to think about it. Here's another way to think about the action research model. Entry is when the consultant enters the scene. Startup is punctuated at the end with a contract for the change effort. Assessment and feedback, and that's the one area where OD differs from the traditional approach to consulting, which we call the expert or medical model. In the expert or medical model, the consultant comes in and does the diagnosis for you, kind of the way a medical doctor does. But in OD runs more like the approach to consulting used by clinical psychologists who follow the humanistic psychology tradition of Carl Rogers. And in the clinical psychology view of the consultant's role, the expert is the people in the organization, not the consultant. And the challenge is that our experts, the people in the company, don't agree among themselves on what the problems are, what the priorities are, what the solutions are, what the priority of the solutions should be, what the action plan should be to implement the desirable solutions, and what are the metrics by which to measure success. That's where OD differs from, in the HR world, the opposite would be performance consulting. And if you want to look it up, and I'm not bad-mouthing performance consulting, I've written college textbooks on both, one on OD, one on performance consulting. For some clients, we want to use the medical doctor expert approach. For other patients, other organizations, we want to use the clinical psychology approach. OD is the clinical psychology approach. What's the difference? Well, with the expert approach, you get results fast, but they generally don't stick. They don't change the corporate culture. An expert comes in, tells you what to do, leaves, and then management and workers find 1,000 excuses why they shouldn't do what the expert advised them to do. And what happens if you choose not to do what your doctor prescribes? Well, you'll probably get sicker. And that's exactly what happens, more often than not, because there's no ownership. If the expert tells you what to do, you have very little stake in following through on what the expert recommends. But if your people come up with the solution, then they have a stake in owning in on the results that they recommended. So this is the steps of the model. The entire graduate program at Penn State's master's program is based on this model, and you basically take courses around the model. So, and we can use it to implement interventions, change efforts to make the corporate culture more welcoming for all diverse populations. So remember culture and what are the driving factors within culture. At the team level, we talk about group norms. A norm is a rule of interaction, how we agree to deal with each other. We learn that through experience. Would you be willing to call your boss at 2 o'clock in the morning to discuss the weather? I bet you aren't willing to do that because you would fear the consequences. The point I'm trying to make is that as we work with people, we learn how to work with people, and those lead to hidden rules of interaction. And those hidden rules are norms, and those are the building blocks of corporate culture. If we want to change corporate culture, we give the people of the organization a new experience. Where did Chinese culture come from? 6,000 years of shared history. Where did Egyptian culture come from? 6,000 years of shared history. Where does corporate culture come from? The shared history of people working together in an organizational environment. And if we want to change the corporate culture, we have to change the experiences we give people. And if the experience is a good one, we want to do more of it. And if the experience is a bad one, we will choose not to do more of the same. So when we talk about corporate culture, that's what we're talking about, giving people shared experience. And the role of the leader is critical in that because he or she leads the way. Mahatma Gandhi is often credited with the famous quote, "You must be the change you wish to see in the world." He actually did not say that, but his writings lead to that kind of thinking. So it's natural that many of us would think that Gandhi said that. He never really said that. But living what you want other people to do is the best way to lead and to teach others. People watch their leaders and they imitate their leaders. And if the leaders are good, then the behavior imitated is good. And if our leaders are bad, what kind of results do you think we're going to end up with? You get my point. So let's talk about diagnosing some of the barriers that can lead to problems in organizational culture in dealing with the neurodiverse population. And we have to identify structural and behavioral obstacles that may exist. And we have to realize that since there are 600 different, at least 600 different neurodivergent conditions, there could be that many different demonstrations of behavior from the neurodiverse. And as a result, the people who interact with them may face different ways of reacting to those issues, those behaviors. So we want to think about communication norms in organizations. For example, in many cultures around the world, we believe that looking someone in the eye is a way to demonstrate sincerity and authenticity. And if we look away from people, it gives the impression that we may not be trustworthy, at least in some cultures. But the neurodiverse may behave in ways different from the cultural norms we've come to expect. And we may need to be sensitive to the fact that not everyone behaves exactly the way we expect them to. And if that's the case, then we're going to have to realize that maybe we're dealing with an individual with a neurodiverse condition. In OD, we use diagnostic tools to try to surface barriers. We go out and we ask people, what are some of the barriers you face in your job, in working with your colleagues? And we honestly want to explore that in a fashion that was well described by Edgar Schein, one of the founders of organization development, in his book, Humble Inquiry. And he said the best thing a leader can be is humble and ask questions of other people and not be the opposite, which is arrogant and think you know everything. Instead, you play dumb because, in all likelihood, you are dumb when it comes to what other people are experiencing. You need to ask them. And as you ask them, you start to surface how they experience the world and what their reality is like. And that's very important in dealing with the neurodiverse and building an inclusive culture. So we can use diagnostic surveys and questionnaires. We can ask people. We can ask them if they want to declare that they have a neurodiverse condition, or even if they don't want to declare they have a neurodiverse condition. What are some of the things that make them uncomfortable, that lead them to want to see a change, and what are the changes that they would like to see? It's actually best to focus on what changes people would prefer. And that way, we don't have to get into the negative differences. Instead, we focus on the positive actions that can be taken that will address some of the people's concerns. So we can use surveys, any of the data collection methods that we're familiar with, like qualitative interviews and process mapping, where we look at how people come in, how they get recruited, how they're onboarded, what they experience as they go through that process, even to the point of experiencing so-called microaggressions, where people may say things or do things that make others uncomfortable, and maybe the person doing it doesn't even realize that they're doing it. So we look at job descriptions for unnecessary jargon and things that may create hidden hurdles and barriers for other people. We look at the workplace environment. And basically, we ask them, how could we make the work setting more inclusive? What actions could we take to address and make the environment more comfortable, psychologically safe for everyone? So there are many interventions. In OD, we talk the change effort, we give the label intervention. And OD has many of those. I like the idea of starting with the leadership and getting our leadership in alignment and our values clarified around the issue of neurodiversity. Where does our organization currently stand with that? And what will people who self-declare as neurodiverse express as concerns they've faced in the past? I've had numerous conversations with people in specific organizations, and they have not been shy about sharing with me some of the challenges they've faced and what they would prefer to see. I always ask, well, what action should the organization take to make your life better and make conditions more inclusive for you? And they always have good answers. And getting those considered is important if we're going to use the OD approach. We gather in the information from all of the people in the OD approach. Then we feed it back and we get agreement on the problems, the priorities, the actions, and the ways by which we will measure success. We can look at redesigning work systems and how we might be able to swap duties across job descriptions if that may be a useful way of addressing reasonable accommodation for diverse conditions. We build psychological safety by creating an environment where people feel safe to be themselves, safe to ask questions, safe to contribute ideas, and not to be reluctant. So it's all about building an inclusive culture and using education and awareness and fostering psychological safety. Some of that starts with training our leaders and how they can best model the appropriate inclusive behaviors. So we want to embed neurodiverse appreciation in HR practices of all kinds. And in fact, that's what my book is about. It talks about a fictitious organization that's set out to make the entire organization more inclusive for the neurodiverse, with the very selfish business goal in mind of being able to tap a broader population of talent for the needs of the business. So businesses don't run for fun or for social causes. They run to make money if it's a for-profit, and if it's a governmental entity, it runs to meet the needs of the citizenry. And in those cases, we have to consider the needs of the organization as well as the needs of the individual. So how do we implement all of this? Well, we engage our neurodiverse employees as co-designers of the change effort. And if they would rather remain anonymous, we give them avenues by which they do not have to declare their conditions if they choose not to do so. Although that raises red flags about the current level of psychological safety that people feel in the organization. So we want to engage our neurodiverse employees as co-designers of the change, and we want to involve all employees in that process. We want to communicate about the issue and sensitize our workers to the needs of neurodiverse workers, and of course other workers as well. We want to measure the outcomes, and one way we can do that is through our annual attitude or engagement surveys. I'm a big fan of engagement surveys. Unfortunately, a lot of organizations do not use them properly. In the OD world, there is a type of change effort called survey-guided development. That's actually the title of many books in organization development. And it describes an organization development approach to using attitude, climate, and engagement surveys to drive social change. And we can very much use that for solving virtually any business problem, including building a more inclusive corporate culture for the neurodiverse. So some of the key metrics we might want to use is voluntary self-disclosure rates, the employee engagement scores, and we know globally worker engagement scores have been falling for some years, in other words, getting worse. Adjustment, accommodation, how well do people feel that their needs are being met when they declare them? The time it takes to get the support they need. There are different ways to measure how inclusive it is. And we want to avoid mere tokenism and sustain that momentum over time, because this issue is not going to go away. Neurodiverse conditions are actually growing. As I said, birth rates of autistic children in particular are on the increase, and as a result, it's very likely that we are going to face increasing need to address the challenges faced by this population. So, integrating neurodiversity into long-term change efforts like OD And diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies involves embedding what we do into our core policies. I advocate pulling out our HR handbook and going through it word by word and seeing how well it aligns with addressing the needs of the neurodiverse. And if we do that, we're more likely to be thinking systemically as opposed to dealing with the individual needs of specific people. And again, we want to focus it at the systemic level rather than lurch from one individual to the next, trying to figure out how to handle the needs of one individual. Better to deal with overall inclusive culture. So that allows some time for some Q&A. That was my goal from the beginning. So here's what I've tried to accomplish. We explained neurodiversity. We talked about OD as different from performance consulting. Performance consulting uses that medical model of the expert coming in and diagnosing the ills of the organization and then prescribing the medicine to cure those ills. OD takes the approach of the humanistic psychologist, which is the person with the problem is the best expert on their problem and the best expert on their solution. The issue is why all of our experts in an organization don't agree on what our problems are, what our solutions are, and what our success measures should be. So the OD facilitator's role is to try to get our internal organizational experts in some level of agreement. You might call the challenge of an OD consultant that of herding cats. And if you've ever tried to get a group of cats to run in the same direction, you know how difficult that is. And when you try to deal with all the people in an organization and try to get them in some level of alignment, you know that that can be quite a challenge. So we talked about the need to identify organizational norms and practices that might send the wrong messages to different categories of employees, including the neurodiverse. We talked about those core OD principles, particularly around the OD action research model, the chip within the OD computer, and how important it is to design an inclusive corporate culture, particularly geared to people with neurodiverse conditions. OD change efforts can support building a culture of psychological safety, inclusion, and equitable treatment of people. So those are some of the things I wanted to talk about in today's session. So our goal was to create an inclusive, neurodiverse corporate culture, implement some practical steps like training people about dealing with the neurodiverse, about sensitizing them to the issues and how to sensitively deal with them, the needs for training, and I would start with leaders, our issues in recruiting, building sensory-friendly workplaces that can help people and deal with the assistive technology needs of the organization. So I'll pause here and take Q&A. Halima and Marcia, maybe you can facilitate the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rothwell. We have 4 questions. The first one is identification of neurodiverse works based on self-disclosure? If so, how do workplaces understand these differences?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question, but I think it's important to remain sensitive to people, and not everyone feels comfortable declaring their neurodiverse condition. So that goes to Which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Which comes first, the psychologically safe work setting or people declaring their neurodiverse conditions and then the organization trying to accommodate those? It's better to, that's what I meant to say about dealing with the issues systemically rather than with individuals. If we single out individuals or ask them to come forward and declare their neurodivergent conditions, that assumes they're comfortable in doing so. And people may not be comfortable in doing so, and they may not want to declare their issues. Like if I have dyslexia, I may not want my boss to know that, because I may worry that that may lead to unfortunate consequences. So as a result, I may not want to disclose that. So a better approach for the organization is to take action and try to anticipate the needs of populations like the dyslexic and try to address their needs without singling out individuals unless they want to self-declare.
Thank you. The second question, where would anxiety fall in this statistics? So you share some statistics and they ask where
does anxiety fall? Well, that
yeah.
raises an excellent question, which is, where does mental disabilities fall under this category? Does it? If we're dealing with the mentally ill, for example, people with schizophrenia or some other diagnosed psychological condition, would we regard that as a neurodivergent condition? And that's somewhat controversial. Some people say yes, some people say no. I'm of the camp that says yes. Why? Because we know that mental health problems are a growing issue globally. 1 in 10 US workers has some kind of mental disorder. And depression is one of the most common. And what's the result of depression? Well, one of many is suicide. And suicide is skyrocketing worldwide. So supervisors are often regarded as the front line. And with younger employees who didn't really have good family backgrounds, sometimes they regard their supervisor as the closest thing to a parent figure they ever had. I can tell you true stories from my experience. Well, I'll tell you one of those quickly. I'm sitting at my desk one day in HR in a multinational company I work for, and the phone rang. And it was the supervisor on the other end in a panic. And she said one of her employees called in and said that she had taken the afternoon off. And when she got home, she found her husband laying passed out on the floor, dead drunk, and her 2 small children, both of them aged 2, were missing. And she didn't know what to do, so she called her supervisor. And then her supervisor was in a panic, and she called me. What do I do to deal with this problem? And I said, for God's sake, call 911 without delay. Call emergency. And then she found the toddlers in the refrigerator. The point of the story is a lot of people think their boss is the closest thing to a parent they have. And when they have psychological conditions like mental illness, often the first person they turn to in a cry for help is their immediate supervisor. It's not HR. It's not somebody in our employee assistance program. It's not a therapist that they've called, it's their boss. So yes, the organization must be prepared to deal with mental disorders, and I think they do get included under neurodiverse conditions because they are a form of disability, in my opinion. So, but not everyone agrees with me. Some people consider that entirely a separate issue.
Thank you. And we have a couple of questions, so because of the time, we can take maybe two. So, will a person suffering from bipolar disorder can be considered as a divergent?
I would consider them a neurodivergent person for the same reason I just explained. Manic depression is a condition that's in the psychological catalog of disabilities as mental disorders. And I would consider any mental disorder a form of neurodiverse divergence because it's a form of invisible disability.
Thank you. And the other question, do leaders really need to know if an employee is neurodivergent, or should inclusion be built into system regardless of discolor?
I think inclusion should be built into an appreciation for these conditions. Again, that's what I meant by creating systemic solutions rather than focusing on individual needs. Because a lot of employees don't feel comfortable coming to anyone in the organization and declaring their condition. And so we should build our systems to accommodate everyone if we can. And we, at the same time, we should build a corporate culture that encourages people to come forward and explain what their issues are. But in many organizations, people don't want to do that. They're very scared they're going to get downsized or laid off or fired for something they can't help.
Thank you. Another question, can you please explain assistive technology?
Explain how technology can help.
Assistive technology.
Oh, assistive technology. Assistive technology is anything that will make it easier for a person with a form of disability to perform their work. As an example, you may or may not know that MS Word has built into it a speech version where you can ask MS Word to read you a document. Why would you want a document read to you? Well, maybe you're blind. And maybe you can't read the screen. So by having a feature where it will read it to you makes it easy for you to do your job because the technology has made it easy for you to interact with MS Word if you're blind. That's an example. There are many forms of assistive technology. Okay, right this moment, I have a metal knee in my leg. That metal knee, that prosthetic, is a form of assistive technology. It helps me perform the function of a knee, even though it is not a natural bone. It's a fake knee bone that's been put in my knee. That's an example of assistive technology. And for every item on a job description, we may be able to find assistive technology that would help a worker with any kind of condition deal with that work duty, make it easier make it possible for them to be able to do that work, just like the blind could access a readout from an MS Word document. That's a workaround.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Rothwell. On behalf of our OD&C Workforce Education and Development Program, we hope that you enjoyed the session today. If we don't get to your question, please send us an email or reach out to the presenters directly via email. For the future webinar, we would like to hear your feedback on today's webinar. There is a poll in the chat, so please take the survey using the link in the chat box or scanning the QR code or the poll. Our next webinar is about ecological intelligence, the other AI transforming how people think, decide, and lead by Peter Demonstrate. On March 27th from 12 until 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Registration for all events are free and can be found on our website. You can also find us on our social media platforms such as Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter. Again, thank you everyone for joining us today, and we hope to see you soon. Have a good day and good night to our guests from other time zone. Thank you.